Welcome to Friday night's video in our second master series. I do believe this is the 83rd video in our second master series. The 32nd video in our basic processors and the 19th video in our reverb and convolution. So basically, the next parameters that I think are the most important, and hopefully that they're included on your convolution reverb, there's a couple different ones. First of all, if we look at an impulse response, that it's very obvious that the impulse response does not start at the same time as whatever you're convolving it onto, like say this drum hit. So, you have a pretty, well-defined ADSR most of the time. Sometimes you'll have it going like this. There's a delay. It comes in. It starts to come up there. It's got an attack. And then, the rest of the ADSR, at the tail end of it's pretty prominent. It comes up in here, and sometimes it's a little bit undefined in that area. But you have to understand that we're dealing with a very minuscule amount of time. So it's not always, but I don't want to say it's not important, because there's a reason why there's tools on our convolution reverb that deal with this, because it is important. But there is an ADSR on here, and it's got a pretty well-defined starting point and end point whenever you're dealing with the impulse response. So when we get done sculpting our impulse responses, that, doing fine-tuning on them, we talked about, trying to, when we were talking about the other parameters, we talked about, well, we've got these small library of impulse responses that we've worked a lot of work on that should be able to cover most ground. Right? If it's well sculpted tracks, if the tracks are done really well, they should be able to cover most ground. That doesn't mean every now and then you don't want to use some boutique responses for some production or something like that. But the more time you spend on your responses and getting familiar with them, the less time you probably will. But that you've got this set a number of responses, which hopefully isn't a huge library, so that you spend all your time digging around responses instead of spending the time sculpting the ones you have well, learning how to, change them a little bit, on the fly when needed, sculpt custom responses from them, or shape them to the sound like we talked about. But sometimes you just want to do a little tweaking on, right? So one of the first areas we'd be talking about is our fade ins and our fade outs. So, our fade in, which isn't the pre-delay, but the fade into the actual peak, the peak area of the impulse response before it starts finishing off through its ADSR and tailing off. That, that fade into that, if you look here on this, that you can see it start to come in and start to cause it to fade in some. It'll actually start causing it to fade into that. Or if I take this off, it's even a little bit more prominent that you can see it fading into it and causing a fade at the beginning of that. This is an immensely helpful tool, to help you adjust that, so that, when you really start tweaking it and you start understanding what's going on with it, that these small differences can make a difference. The more you get to be that next level master audio engineer, you might come in here with this impulse response. You might come in there, you might put a little bit of fade in on it, because it's not quite enough. You might want to fade it into here. Does that make sense? You're probably fading it in to 10 milliseconds to where it's peaking and knocking the rest of this that's kind of non-distinct, nondescript there. And fade outs, you got a fade out that also is going to help you, help fade that out, contour the fade so that it's got a nicer shape at the fade end. If you don't have just cut this impulse response cut to 1 second. But sometimes you can start to fade that out a little bit, or even just start to roll it in some. That can help you also when you're dealing with your lengths and all those things like that, mix and, in conjunction with the other parameters you're adjusting, which, just the simple fade in and fade out cause you to go back and readjust these ones here, but it's working together with them to give you a lot more control of the actual impulse response, so that you choose one that's pretty close to what you're trying to get, and then, start tweaking the one you got with some of these parameters. So the fade in and fade out are huge. They really can just make the difference, of milliseconds of what's happening with your attack coming in and your fading out to make it just right for whatever the heck you're doing. So you really want to familiarize yourself with those, because you're a lot better than trying to go deal with impulse response and going into the track, and taking the impulse response out, putting a fade in on it, and doing things like that to try to sculpt it in the way that you want it, or using volume automation. That these tools can be very helpful for just very detailed work as you become that next level master audio engineer, tweaking, the beautiful responses that you've created and worked on. And the next one is really cool, because the next one allows us to do something that we can do in our sound sculpting. There's no doubt about that. We can go into here, and I can take this here, and I can go in here and I can cut this impulse response right about there, right where the later reflections start. Let's go out to about there. And I can start adjusting those in different ways with volume automation, rebalancing, and things like that, separating the early and late reflections. Like when we're talking about like the C50 clarity guides. Well, instead of doing that and fussing with that, this parameter here will help us deal with that, so that we've got some type of a crossover that's going to allow us to have a crossover point, and then being able to attenuate or boost either side of that to focus on one side or the other. Early reflections and late reflections going in one way or the other. The cool thing about this is sometimes you've got this impulse response, but you really want to focus, keep it clean. So you really want to come in here and you want to really focus on preserving the early reflections here, but you want to cut out the later reflections. So you're really starting to cut out the later reflections, or completely eliminating them, to keep your mix clean. And you can adjust this however far over that you want until you're getting the effect of the spatialization of the early reflections, but it's helped keeping it clean, that it's not using the whole response by mudding the mix with tails and things like that, which is a whole other beautiful way we can sound sculpt the wonderful impulse responses we have to help detail them to whatever we got going on. Like a vocal, you got a vocal that's rambling along, and then I just want to go down to the river and I, and it's like you don't want a whole lot of things going on there, and it might be too much. So you might really back off on your wet and dry. You might mess with some of your lengths and your pre-delay, but be able to just come in here and adjust it here and say, well, I'm gonna keep bringing this back until I don't. So it's giving it a nice, presence, and this can be with bodybuilding responses or our spatialization responses. So it's giving it that room presence, but there's not a whole lot of tail coming after it, so that it's breaking off long before the next word starts. When dealing things like, I call it staccato singing, or solos, or things that are moving around real fast that you don't want to take a chance of muddying. And this can really help define that. Now, there's also the reverse of that. In case you don't want to just try to focus on using the early reflections, that you want to use the later reflections. So in that same breath, you can use the later reflections. You can either really, attenuate the early reflections, or completely wipe them out and adjust this over, because you might have a drum that you want to really, just an example. It could be words or anything, but you got to drum it, and you've sculpted it perfectly, and it's like, bam, and it's just like, yeah, it's got punches, got everything, dude, yeah. And you don't want to muddy it up, with early reflections coming on top of it. You want it to go off for a second to really let without convolving anything else onto it, because you spend a lot of time, it sounds great, and you don't want to mess with it, but you want to get this like, bam, bam, and you can shorten that. It can be like bam, 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 bam. I mean, all kinds of different things. Or sooner. There's lots of different applications of that. And that can be on vocals also. You really need to think about where all that can be applicable to really utilize it. But those are two of the biggest things that you're really going to run into. First of all, you not want tails running out, but being able to preserve the spatialization effect without having tail interference. and you don't want to go to such a small response that it really isn't working well, because sometimes I'll use a little bit bigger response than I normally would, and I'll cut down its length or its amount of mix in there and do some work like this with my fade ins and fade outs, because it has a little more girth to it being a bigger response sometimes. Does that make sense? And or the reverse of that, to where you want it to tail out, but you don't want it to be hit it. You know, you've got maybe 10 milliseconds before it starts peaking, you know, from this pre-delay up to about 10 milliseconds, then it rolls out. So somewhere from here, 10 milliseconds out, somewhere out away from there, you're going to move this to where you preserve the clarity of that drum hit. Just as an example of that snare. Snap, bam, bop, you know, and then it's like bop, wow, bop. And it might, sometimes it's very subtle. Sometimes it's very subtle just to give the effect of spatialization. So you're trying to get it up as close as possible without affecting, you know, that beautiful snap and crack of that snare drum. And sometimes you're wanting to move it back, you know, and you're trying to, you know, really have it be an effect of bam, stop, you know, because it's like, you know, having a hit and it's audible, you know, it's in a space, you know, this, we can always come back to whether it's audible or not, and you're causing mud. So it's one of the biggest reasons why I really want you to master your convolution reverb, so you really start hearing when you start bringing things in the mix, when things are being muddy and when it's audible, you know, critical listening, you know, acute listening. But these are two great uses for this. I mean, there's probably a lot more, but the fundamental concerns are there. That basically you're being able to take this impulse response and get the focus between early and late reflections in different ways, and using it in combination with the other parameters you have on the convolution reverb to, you know, attain those early reflections, room, you know, ambient sound without getting the tail, and to different degrees and in different ways, and being able to get a tail off a nice snap of a snare. You know, it's nice and clean, and then you got that nice ambience thing coming after it, you know, that's more subtle in the background, that's not affecting the initial hits so much. Does that make sense? Because sometimes it's way far out, it gets too close, and the ear thinks that it's convolved together, the sound's too close to at the same time, where it's not an after effect, like the room is an after effect after that well sculpted drum. And the ear, sometimes if it's too close, that it doesn't distinguish between the two of those. Does that make sense? So those are just two examples on our next biggest parameters using our convolution reverb. And some of the biggest advice that I give you is really think about that, because this is the next biggest parameters you have on your convolution reverb, to really take the small library of impulses and responses we have and really be able to, you know, just fine tune the ones we have and tweak the small library we have, that with the rest of the tools that we have on our convolution reverb, you know, that we really should be able to get the effect that we want without having to resculpt a different impulse response, unless it's a boutique application, you know, and we're going to resculpt a whole response from a flat response that's tailored to a certain situation. Does that make sense? Now we've got some other ones here that we're going to talk about that are on my convolution reverb, may or may not be on yours, but we'll talk about them a little bit, and a couple other things on the convolution reverb. But these parameters here, your length, your pre-delay, your wet and dry, and your early late reflection, you know, thing here, to where you can pan between the two of them to really do some fine detail work and micro work. The responses you have are going to be the biggest tools that you have on your convolution reverb, and you're going to want to master those. I mean, master your understanding of those, what's happening, test them, experiment with it, really understand what's happening there, so that you get the most power out of your convolution reverb. Peace, hope, love. I certainly hope you enjoyed this next video on parameters, and I'll see you in the next video.